Hi, I'm Ryan Szymanski, curator for Battleship New Jersey Museum and Memorial, and today we've got a video that's been sponsored by a viewer like you. He specifically asked us to compare the Cleveland-class light cruiser USS Topeka to an Iowa-class battleship. Now, for today's video we're going to be using Wayne Smith's model collection here, and these models give you an idea of the absolute disparity between a Cleveland and an Iowa. So, we're going to talk a little bit about the Cleveland class, and we're going to talk about these two classes' abilities to be updated over time. And that's what we'll compare to judge their utility versus each other. Because Topeka received some major modifications, probably even more so than the Iowa class received in the 1980s. The thing that is often the most limiting to a ship's long-term utility is the reserve of buoyancy. The reserve of buoyancy is how much extra weight you can add onto a ship before it becomes unstable or likely to sink. Ships that are too high out of the water can be tipped over by waves or wind action, and they're likely to sink and are unstable. Ships that are too low in the water don't have enough reserve of buoyancy, and if they take on any additional weight or water from damage, things like that, then they will sink, and that's pretty unstable too. So designers have to really strike a balance. That is certainly easier to do when you're working with a large ship like an Iowa-class battleship. The Cleveland-class cruisers are less than a quarter of the displacement of an Iowa-class battleship. Original designs for the class were only about 8,000 tons. They grew to 10,000 tons just before the U.S. entered World War II, and the ships would be launched with a standard displacement of about 12,000 tons and a maximum displacement around 14,000 tons. So this is a far cry from the 45,000 tons that they're designing the Iowa class to be, and the 57,500 tons that New Jersey attains under a full load displacement. They have a lot less to work with, and early on, they had a clear purpose for the ship in mind, but how they were going to attain that purpose really changed over the design period, and that's where a lot of the difficulties with the Cleveland class comes into mind. So, the United States has been building 10,000-ton, 8-inch armed heavy cruisers throughout the interwar treaty period. The 1936 London Navy Treaty limits the caliber of guns to 6 inches on cruisers. The number of battleships you could build was limited, so the arms race moved down a notch to cruisers. The US Navy was okay with accepting this because, especially in this pre-radar fire control time period, the 8-inch gun was definitely a superior shell, but you could only fire 3 rounds per minute per barrel. Remember, it's 2 rounds per minute per barrel for an Iowa-class gun, so you're not actually throwing that much weight, and with that few shells going out in a minute, you're less likely to hit a target at all. So they really liked their 6-inch 47 caliber gun. You could attain higher rates of fire, close to 10 rounds per minute, and even though the shell is significantly smaller, you can absolutely smother your target. What's more, you're going to be carrying more barrels than an 8-inch armed ship. The pinnacle of this is the Brooklyn-class light cruiser. For the U.S. Navy, these are armed with 15 6-inch guns and then 8 5-inch guns as their anti-aircraft battery. The throw weight that these can put out per minute is ridiculous, and sure, their range is significantly shorter than an 8-inch gun, but you're just putting so many rounds towards the target that you are going to score hits, and those hits are going to rack up. Shortly before the war, the U.S. Navy released a subvariant of the Brooklyns, the St. Louis. Pretty much the same ship. They have the same main battery, but they switch to 4 twin mounts for the 5-inch 38. So these ships end up with a better anti-aircraft armament. So this is really the starting point for the next light cruiser. There's also a limitation in place that wants to keep light cruisers from being 10,000 tons and wants to knock them down to 8,000 tons. So, the US Navy realizes that their existing ships have a deficient anti-aircraft battery, and they want to supplement that. So, from the Brooklyn class and the St. Louis variant, they go to the Atlanta class cruisers, armed with all 5-inch 38 caliber guns and coming in at under 8,000 tons displacement. These ships are providing the anti-aircraft role that's needed for the fleet. So the Navy starts looking at a ship with 5 twin 6-inch 47 caliber guns. They start looking at an automatic mount for these guns so they can take the great rate of fire of the Brooklyn St. Louis class and turn it into an anti-aircraft powerhouse like the Atlanta class. So early designs are looking at using that. And that ship will be built relatively similar to those original designs. This is the Worcester class light cruisers. But the twin automatic mounting was not complete. And the US Navy was really deficient in light cruisers when World War II started. The beginning of World War II throws the treaty system out the window, and it really lights a fire under the US Navy. Even though they won't enter the war for another 2 years, they start looking at what they need, and the Two-Ocean Navy Act provides them the funding to get it. They just need something that's ready to go right now. So they take a Brooklyn-class hull, and they still want an anti-aircraft ship, but they don't have that automatic mounting yet. So they remove one of the 6-inch turrets, the one that would be right here, and they replace it with another 2 5-inch 38s. Because these 2 5-inch 38s are able to be placed on the center line, it's essentially doubling the anti-aircraft rate of fire of a ship like St. Louis and adding 50% more fire on each end. So not only are these going to continue to be excellent surface combatants with 12 6-inch guns, each firing 10 rounds per minute, but now with 12 5-inch guns, each firing about 12 rounds per minute with marginally less range. The 6-inch gun has a range of about 13 miles. The 5-inch guns have a range of about 9 or 10 miles. So you're subtracting 3 6-inch barrels, you're adding 4 more 5-inch barrels. You're getting a lot of extra anti-aircraft. So the Cleveland class is adding a fair amount without too much of a drawback. The problem is, because of this tortured design process, originally looking at twin turrets, originally looking at 8,000-ton ships, moving to the Brooklyn class, having to subtract armor and some other stuff, these ships end up being built with very, very little margin for improvement. They're already top-heavy before they enter the war, which is a huge problem because during the war, the US Navy is adding new electronics on all these ships. While these ships will deploy with radar, as their design process started, radar wasn't on all ships yet. And the number of anti-aircraft guns are going to drastically increase. To do this, the US Navy takes one of the catapults off of each of these ships, which impacts their ability to scout. That's okay, they're primarily operating with the aircraft carriers anyway as anti-aircraft escorts, so the carriers are doing all the scouting with their onboard aircraft. And they also lose the rangefinder to turret 1, which that forwardmost lowest turret, those rangefinders are pretty wet. That buys them a little bit of room to add extra anti-aircraft and radar, but it isn't a whole heck of a lot. Immediately post-war, the Fargo class, which is a subset of the Clevelands, will improve this by going to the pyramidal style superstructure of late war American ships. The Des Moines class cruisers are an outstanding extant example of this. But by trunking the funnels together, by moving the superstructure, they managed to save some top weight and free up the arcs of fire for the anti-aircraft guns. They also move the 5-inch guns down a deck and lower the height of the 6-inch guns each by about a foot, so that saves a little bit of weight as well. But again, this is just getting them to a barely acceptable margin of safety. None of these ships would be lost, even though many of them go through Halsey's Typhoon. Look at this crazy picture of the bow of one of them really badly slanted in the storm. But They have some serious issues with top weight and other things like that. And that limits their ability to be modified. The thing that they have going in their favor, though, is that there's something like 29 of them that are completed as cruisers, if you count the Clevelands and the Fargos, and another 9 that are completed as Independence-class aircraft carriers. And they're largely share a lot of interchangeable parts with the very large class of Baltimore heavy cruisers. So these ships are around in large numbers. Many of them do yeoman service throughout the war. They start to come online in late 42, early 43. But many of them aren't completed until 1945 or immediately post-war. In fact, several of them are scrapped on the building ways because the war ends. But with all these ships lying around and all these parts for the ships, the Navy is able to modify them. Immediately post-war, the Navy starts to develop missile technology. And it'll take a long time to build a new ship armed with missiles, but it's relatively easy to take some of these existing ships in numbers and cut them up and add missiles to them. So they actually take 6 of the completed Cleveland-class cruisers and they turn them into 2 different classes of missile-armed cruisers. The hero of today's video, Topeka, isn't commissioned until 1945. She sees combat action both off of Japan and off Okinawa that earns her 2 battle stars. But she arrives relatively late in the war and is one of the later Clevelands that's actually commissioned. With the size of the fleet being reduced during the post-war period, most of the Cleveland-class cruisers are decommissioned by 1950. But because Topeka has relatively light mileage, she's selected to get converted into a Providence-class guided missile cruiser. This involves removing the aft superstructure, the aft 3 twin 5-inch gun mounts, the aft 2 6-inch gun mounts, and all the aviation stuff back here. And they add Terrier missiles in a 2-year conversion. This allows her to stay in commission for another 9 years, which outlasts all of the gun-armed cruisers of her class. One near sister, Little Rock, still survives today. She was armed with the Talos missiles as an Oklahoma City sub-variant, as opposed to the Providence class, but she is the last surviving Cleveland-class cruiser. So how do these ships stack up to the Iowa class? The Iowa class was born with a massive reserve of buoyancy. The Cleveland class was born with, actually they probably were designed with an insufficient amount of reserve of buoyancy, but managed to claw some back over the years by trading stuff out every time something new was added on. But at the end of the day, the Cleveland class was cheap enough and around in large enough numbers that they were retained in the fleet, especially ships like Topeka, where the Iowa class disappears for long periods of time. While they were active during different decades, the active service life of those Cleveland-class cruisers that are converted is very similar to the active service life of the Iowa-class battleships. And so despite being handicapped both in their original size and in their lack of reserve of buoyancy, these ships managed to find a useful place in the U.S. Navy for just as long as the Iowa-class battleships. And keep in mind, the Iowa-class battleships were being brought back because they were the last class of battleships we ever built. Nothing ever took the large caliber shore bombardment role away from these ships. So whenever we needed them, we brought them back. There were other classes of cruisers, other classes of ships with guns, other classes of ships with missiles, and yet these Cleveland-class cruisers continued to soldier on throughout much of the Cold War. So what's a ship you'd like to see in a future comparison video? Let us know in the comments section down below. Battleship New Jersey receives operating support from the New Jersey Department of State, also from a number of other businesses and private individuals like yourselves. Tonight's video was supported by the family of Captain Charles Dykeman, who served on board USS Topeka from from 1964 to 1966 as the damage control assistant and an engineering duty officer. He also went on to serve as the commanding officer of the Brooklyn Navy Yard and the Long Beach Naval Shipyard, both places with great Iowa-class battleship associations. You can support the channel via the link in the description below, or by liking, sharing, and subscribing so more people find about us in the museum. Thanks for watching.